Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and it is as follows. In what appeared to be a possible breakthrough in the Middle East peace talks, Secretary of State John Kerry and Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to the details of a deal which would include the U.S. release of convicted Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard in return for Israeli concessions with the Palestinians to continue the peace talks past April the 29th. Pollard, an American citizen who was granted Israeli citizenship in 1995, pleaded guilty in 1987 and was convicted of spying for Israel. He has spent more than 25 years in a U.S. jail. He would be released around Passover in exchange for the release of 400 Palestinian prisoners. According to the deal, the peace talks would extend into 2015. Kerry wanted Netanyahu to call a cabinet meeting to approve this deal. However, a number of government ministers and coalition members announced that they would not support a deal to free Palestinian prisoners, even if it included convicted U.S. Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard. Israel Transportation Minister Yisrael Katz said that if the United States wants to make a true gesture of friendship, it should free Pollard without conditions so that he can have Passover dinner with his family in Israel. This is how allies behave. In addition, Israel Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman attacked a possible deal between Israel, the United States, and the Palestinians to release more Palestinian Arab and Israeli Arab terrorists, saying he would oppose any arrangement that would include releasing high-security prisoners who are citizens of the State of Israel. We have to manage the conflict as best as possible, Lieberman said. I do not know if this is a real crisis or a fabricated crisis. Whether it is serious or tactical or strategic, we will get the answer to this in the coming days, he continued. The State of Israel did everything, and now the ball is in the Palestinians' court. With every crisis, there is also a chance for success. We have something waiting on the political horizon, and it does not have to be the Palestinians, he added. If they do not want to negotiate, it's their decision, and theirs only. When the Palestinians joined the UN organization UNESCO, it didn't give them independence or bring about Middle East peace, Lieberman said. It's a mistake for them to go to the UN, but it's what they want to do, and it's their right. We proved Israel is ready to reach a final status agreement with the Palestinians, he said, but as much as Israel wants to have an agreement, it doesn't look like it's happening. In the last government, we also made difficult gestures to the Palestinians for peace, including a settlement freeze. And then, too, it didn't get us a millimeter closer to an agreement with the Palestinians. The detail of the proposed deal involved the following parameters. Number one, the Palestinians would agree to extend negotiations into 2015 and avoid unilateral moves at the United Nations. Number two, Israel will release the fourth group of Palestinian prisoners, which will include 14 Israeli Arab prisoners. Number three, Israel will release another 400 Palestinian prisoners without blood on their hands who are about to finish their jail sentences. And number four, Israel will freeze most of the construction in the settlements with the exception of East Jerusalem. However, several hours prior to Netanyahu calling a cabinet meeting to approve this U.S. plan to extend peace talks, Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas sent out applications for the independent Palestinian state to join 15 UN agencies as members. He indicated that he anticipated that membership would be smoothly granted. The Palestinians' envoy to the United Nations, Riyad Mansour, said the requests were a formality and that their membership in the treaties would come into effect 30 days after the Secretary General receives the letter of accession. In doing so, Abbas turned his back on a commitment he made prior to the start of direct peace talks to not take unilateral steps to join UN organizations while peace talks were in progress. Israel Knesset member Yuli Edelstein said that the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas's decision to sign applications to join international organizations is an outrageous violation of the conditions to renew negotiations, since the Palestinians committed to not take any unilateral steps to receive international recognition at the United Nations during the time of the direct peace talks. As a result of the move, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry canceled plans for a meeting with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas to continue the peace talks past April the 29th. A Palestinian official said that Palestine had signed applications to join treaties on human, civil, disabled, and women's rights. The first document Abbas signed was the Fourth Geneva Convention, sources in the Palestinian Authority said. A member of Abbas's Fatah faction said that although Abbas didn't sign applications for the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, applying for membership there would be the next step. Palestinians said the public unilateral move to sign the applications was prompted by Israel's decision to condition the release of a fourth group of Palestinian prisoners held in its jails to an agreement to extend the peace talks beyond their April 29th deadline. Palestinian Authority Foreign Minister Riyad al-Malki handed the letters to UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Robert Sari, and said, "These treaties and conventions will help to protect and promote the basic rights of the Palestinian people and will enable the State of Palestine to be a responsible actor on the international stage." Ashraf Khativ, a communication advisor to the Palestinian Negotiations Affairs Department, said, "These treaties are vital to continued Palestinian institutional building, good governance, and the upholding of human rights, all of which form the basis for an independent and sovereign state of Palestine. Palestine will pursue this nonviolent track, including all possible diplomatic venues, in a way which serves the best interests of its people and the causes of a just peace." The Palestinians do not plan to stop at joining these 15 UN entities. The Palestinian ambassador to the United Nations said his government may seek to join the International Criminal Court and more UN agencies if there is no progress in the peace talks with the Israelis. The Palestinian ambassador to the UN, Riyad Mansour, said that the 15 international conventions the Palestinians are seeking to join were just a first group and more could follow depending upon Israel's actions. What the Palestinians did is legal, he insisted, saying it is our right to join UN treaties and agencies since the Palestinians obtained the status of an observer state at the United Nations in November of 2012. Our inclusion in the Geneva Convention will be effective immediately because we are under occupation, Mansour claimed, adding that these applications are just a first wave with more coming depending upon the interest of the Palestinian people as well as the behavior of Israel. Despite the Palestinian intention to join UN organizations, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said that the United States has every intention of moving the peace process forward. What is important to say about the Middle East right now is it is completely premature tonight to draw any kind of judgment and certainly any final judgment about today's events and where things are, Kerry said. This is a moment to be really clear-eyed and sober about this process. It is difficult, it is emotional, it requires huge decisions, some of them with great political difficulty, all of which need to come together simultaneously. Kerry refused to place responsibility for the crisis on any of the parties. Now obviously the Palestinian prisoners were due to be released on March the 29th, Kerry said. I'm not going to get into the who, why, what, when, where, how of why where we are today. And the important thing is to keep the process moving and to find a way to see whether the parties are prepared to move forward. In the end, this is up to the parties. However, a senior U.S. official said that the Americans believe Israel and the Palestinians should find a way out of this latest deadlock themselves, terrorists, and that Kerry's current efforts have been exhausted. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, said that the United States opposes all unilateral actions that the Palestinians take to statehood. U.S. lawmakers said that they were unhappy about the Palestinian leadership's decision to sign more than a dozen international conventions and warned that it could trigger a cutoff of U.S. aid. A spokesman for Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah faction admitted that the Palestinians are blackmailing Israel into releasing Palestinian terrorist prisoners. Spokesman Ahmad Asaf revealed on official Palestinian television that the Palestinians are using its non-member observer status in the United Nations, granted in November of 2012, as a weapon against Israel. Given the UN status, the Palestinians have been waving around the threat of going to the International Criminal Court for around 2 years, according to Asaf. We've obtained the release of the prisoners, we've blackmailed Israel, and we've taken important positions because we have a card that we're waving around, he said. Senior Palestinian Liberation Organization official Nabil Sha'ath revealed last November that the Palestinians are only staying in the peace talks to secure the release of the 104 Palestinian terrorists promised by Israel as a goodwill gesture to restart peace talks last July. Israel Justice Minister Tzipi Livni spoke out strongly against the Palestinian Authority after Palestinian Chairman Mahmoud Abbas applied to the United Nations and other international organizations for legitimacy. The Palestinians have breached its obligations in peace talks by applying to the United Nations, Livni stated. If they want a state, they need to understand that it will only be established on the negotiating table with Israel. Calling recent events complicated, Livni said that her team will continue representing the interests of the State of Israel despite the move and urged the government to return to talks. Not the Palestinians nor anyone else can dictate to us whether or not we are fighting for peace, she continued, even when peace seems to be very far away and when the other side's conduct is wrong. Israel will still return to the negotiating table because we are obligated to seeking peace through direct talks. Meanwhile, the Palestinians have compiled a new list of demands for the continuation of peace talks, ranging from the release of some 1,200 Palestinian prisoners to a written commitment by Israel accepting the Palestinian state based upon 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. This list was presented by Palestinian chief negotiator Saeb Erekat and Muhammad al-Alul, a Fatah Central Committee member, and indicated a hardening of positions by the Palestinians as talks appear to be collapsing. These new lists of Palestinian demands include the following. Number 1, a written commitment by Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the borders of a future Palestinian state will be along the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Number 2, the release of 1,200 Palestinian prisoners, including political heavyweights Marwan Barghouti, Ahmed Saadat, and Fawad Shubki. Number 3, an end to the Egyptian-Israeli blockade on Gaza and the formulation of a policy allowing for the free flow of goods into the Gaza Strip. Number 4, a halt to Israeli construction in East Jerusalem. Number 5, the Israeli army will not be allowed to enter Area A, the area of the West Bank under autonomous Palestinian control since the signing of the 1993 Oslo Accords, to conduct arrests or assassinations. Number 6, Israel will permit the Palestinians control over Area C. This is the area of the West Bank currently under Israeli control. Number 7, the Palestinians known as the Church of the Nativity Deportees, a group of terrorists who barricaded themselves in the Bethlehem Church of the Nativity on April 2, 2002, and were later deported to European nations in the Gaza Strip, will be allowed to return to the West Bank. And finally, number 8, the reopening of a number of Palestinian development agencies that Israel has shut down. As a result of the Palestinian intention to apply to 15 UN organizations and refusal to extend negotiations with Israel into 2015, Israel said that it will not release the fourth batch of 26 Palestinian terrorists it was to have freed on March the 29th. According to Israel chief negotiator Tzipi Livni, since the agreement to release them was dependent on the Palestinians upholding their commitment not to turn to international organizations, Israel cannot release the fourth batch of Palestinian prisoners, Livni said. Well, that's going to conclude this week's report, where we shared with you regarding the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Shalom in